You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Wednesday, everybody. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, a special edition, the first of a two-part special where we begin to preview the game, Ohio State-Michigan. The second part will come on Thanksgiving, and you'll be able to enjoy two Unscripted Ohio's as we get you ready for Saturday, noon kickoff, Ohio State and Michigan. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. We are brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. So I'm very excited. In this first edition today, we've got Daniel and Josh. They are of SECfans.com. You're probably wondering why the heck do we have a couple of guys that go by the moniker SEC fans. That will become apparent. I will let them explain in their own words what they do and what it is we're going to talk about. But spoiler alert, they have some excellent data and computer modeling and some insight as to how they project this game. We will talk about the matchups between Ohio State and Michigan with them. And I promise you, you will not be disappointed. It's very good information. They're very insightful. They use advanced analysis and statistics and computer modeling to form their opinion, but they are also very savvy about college football, and I think you will enjoy what they have to say. Also coming up later in the show, Austin Fox. He is a beat writer of thewolverine.com, the Wolverine magazine covering Michigan. He will join us as we get the enemy side of things here for the matchup on Saturday. We'll find out the latest on Chase Winovich, and we'll talk to him about Michigan's defense and how they're viewing this game. Are they nervous? Are they excited? Are the fans amped up? Do they think they're going to win? We'll get all of that from Austin when he joins us. Tomorrow, the Thanksgiving special and part 2 of the podcast, by the way, Bill Bender, the always great Bill Bender of the Sporting News, will be on. We'll talk a little more big picture stuff. We'll talk about Ohio State, Michigan. We'll talk playoff scenarios, all that good stuff. And then also, Mark Gibler, recruiting analyst of BuckeyeGrove.com, will be joining us, and we will talk about a big visitor list, a big visitor weekend for the Buckeyes coming up. But I am very excited about all of these things and the two-part special. And, of course, it's a big week for college football, big week for Ohio State. But let's dive right into it. Rather than me, sitting here giving my take on the game, which I will probably do in part 2 this week, let's dive right into the analysis because I think you're going to like what Daniel and Josh of SECfans.com have to say. So I know people are probably asking, well, why the heck are a couple of SEC guys helping to preview Ohio State, Michigan? That's a really good question. And Daniel, let me start with you. So first of all, explain what it is you guys do, and then we can kind of help go into people. It'll make more sense for people to understand why you guys are here on the podcast talking about this.
Sure, absolutely. So basically, we are both giant nerds, and we love college football. We're kind of in SEC country now, so we went with the SEC fans sort of, website and domain and all that, and for the show because we watch mostly SEC football, but we're college football fans. So we actually found some decent traction outside the SEC because there's a little layer of objectivity, and I know people probably rolling their eyes right now, but for a lot of these games, we don't have a dog in the fight. And there's a lot of crosstalk. When Michigan and Ohio State play, there's a lot of Michigan insight and there's a lot of Ohio State insight. But for us, it's just pure numbers, and that's what our show is. It's basically we try to avoid gut and the old adages that everybody throws towards football games and just say, okay, what does the data say? And then can we look at what the data is showing us, even if we think the model might be wrong, and glean from it some trends. And when we applied it to a few outside of the SEC games, we actually got a lot of traction with people going, wow, a couple of SEC guys that aren't bringing their flamethrowers and are pretty objective.
So, Josh, you helped shape this model, and basically, or did shape this model. And so, if you would explain, what it is first you do, and what attracted you to get into this, and then how you came up with the model, and kind of how walk people through basically what it attempts to do, and how you put it together, and all that.
The model, first and foremost, is trying to set a baseline. So when we have our discussions, like he said, we try not to get into gut too much. And what really kind of irked both of us is you watch a lot of national media now, and frankly, there's a lot of hot takes and quick tweetable facts or
no, you don't
details. Say. And no, I'm sure you've never experienced that. We like to get into stuff that we can actually quantify or qualify with some sort of objective basis. The model as a baseline is pretty simple in concept, that we look at how you did versus your opponents, how your opponents have done versus everyone else. We focus on per play statistics because if you look at total yardage or those kinds of stats, those tend to be affected too much by tempo or other factors. And then based off that, we get an idea of what your projection should be against the team you're playing, based off the given matchups you have, their strengths and your strengths. If you both bring a B-plus game, your average B-plus game against your opponents versus their average B-plus game against their opponents, how does that look against each other, completely controlled for opponent quality? And then based off that, we get some production. And then based off the production, the next thing the model does is it looks at your own history for each team, and it builds a unique scoring model that's actually tailored to your team. And from there, we can get a score that's not just linear or points per play, but it's a little more nuanced in terms of knowing if you cross a certain threshold, you may start scoring a lot of points. And if you fall below a certain threshold, you may not score much at all. And really, the design of the model is to give a very neutral, I won't say simplistic, but a baseline where I'm not putting any of my own variables in here. I'm just letting the computer drive it. So we have a good starting point for discussion without any sort of, talk that goes around it.
Have you guys, I'm curious, do you, like early in the season, like the first half of the year, do you use any data from the previous years? I know some models do, some models don't. Kind of what's your stance on using prior season input to help shape the model?
Yeah, we don't. And that's why one of the things that we do with the model, because a lot of people like what we have to say outside of the model, but the model is kind of a centerpiece for our show. We actually don't bring it out until week 4 because we don't want, first of all, data from the previous season. And we got an anecdote a little bit with Miami this year that Josh might want to get into. Data from the previous season is really hard. Because their teams are so new year to year, and then data within the first couple of weeks tells a lot more lies than it does truths because you have so few data points. And really what's valuable to us are data points outside of conference. And there's probably a Citadel joke in here somewhere, but I'll let that go for another day. So by week 4, you have some in-conference and out-of-conference data points for Power 5, G5 teams, and it tends to sort of shape itself a little bit, and it's still a little wonky early in the season. But by the end of the year, it starts to round out pretty well, especially for the better teams.
So we are talking with Daniel and Josh. They are SECfans.com. You can follow them on Twitter at SECfans. So, Josh, I want to throw this at you. We kind of look ahead here to Ohio State, Michigan. And, you mentioned this on your podcast, the previewing this game here this week. And this is kind of interesting to me because a lot of people are asking, well, how do you model a rivalry game? And you said something that was interesting to me, that you said you think rivalry games, for as far as data modeling, is actually more accurate than some other games because you used the LSU example. You don't know if teams like LSU are going to show up every week, but a rivalry game, you can pretty much expect both teams to be motivated and show up. So in this game, in your mind, you actually think the modeling might be a little more accurate than other games in weeks past.
Right. So the point I made is that rivalry games, in general, I think don't really. Everybody looks at you. You throw out the score, you throw out everything else. I think the reality of it is when you play a team that you have motivation against, you're going to generally get your A game every time, and the opposing team's going to throw their A game into it. The most difficult thing for models is inconsistency in teams that don't want to be there. It's the Auburn UCF game, whether or not you believe that mattered. It's LSU pretty much all year who's destroyed our ability to pick against the spread because they can't decide whether they want to show up every week or not. I think it's easy to underestimate how much most weeks are in flux. And I say that because is any game predictable at a very, very high level in college football? Not exactly. It's a very variable sport. One fumble can turn into 7 points one way or another. It tends to have a lot of volatility. But we focus on these rivalry games and sort of ignore the fact that they actually are more predictable than non-rivalry games. You're less likely to get the sort of result like Ohio State just faced last week, Ohio State, Maryland. You have really weird games all the time. When you have a rivalry game, it tends to be fairly close to the quality of both teams, at least more often than it would in other games.
This rivalry, the trend and has been fascinating to watch because I went back and was looking, based on your discussion about this on your podcast, and I was looking, and back in the 90s to early 2000s, there was a trend there where the favorite, which was usually Ohio State, but not every year, but the favorite did not cover but maybe one time out of 7, and then the favorite from a span in the early 2000s through 2012. Like Ohio State covered 6 out of 7 as the favorites, and then the last 5 years they've only covered 1 out of 5. So it's interesting that it's been very streaky. And so Daniel, I'm curious your take on this. If there's anything to be gleaned from that, is it just a weird outlier, or what would you make of that trend?
I think sometimes it might just be. So we discuss a couple of things when we talk about modeling and statistics. One is variability, and that's relative to the teams. So, last year I think we had 31-17 was our model for this game, the game. And I think it was 31-20. But also you had a backup quarterback come in. That's something we can't model for. And then Michigan, Penn State, just a couple of weeks ago, we got killed because our model picked Michigan, but the score ended up being 42-7. And our model was a lot closer. But we can't model for things like a backup quarterback coming in and throwing a pick 6 and things like that. But one thing I do think is interesting, talking about what Josh just said, with teams generally bringing their A game, we've seen a lot of fall off in every year with LSU, where after they lose a game, because they're such an emotional driven team, after they lose a game, and it's usually with Alabama, so they come in late in the year pretty ranked, they have a tremendous fall off, and they'll lose to somebody random like Arkansas. Well, I think what's really analogous there this year is Penn State and Ohio State. Both of those teams were up for that game. Both of those teams brought their A game. And does anybody think that Penn State down the stretch since they lost that game has been anywhere near the same team?
No, they definitely have not. This I think you guys hit on a subject that I think is going to be really key to this game and that is Michigan's defense against a legitimate passing attack, because we have not seen it this year, and we don't know how they're going to respond to it. I thought Ohio State's pass efficiency was much better against Maryland than it had been in the previous couple of weeks, and that was kind of encouraging from an Ohio State perspective, just from the standpoint that Maryland's defense is actually, kind of underrated, I think, nationally, giving up 324 yards a game, had a pretty good pass efficiency defense. And so for Ohio State to have the pass game it had against Maryland, I think, was somewhat encouraging. And I know they're facing a different beast. But, Josh, I think that the key, I think you guys hit on this in your show, I think the key will be, can Ohio State maintain some level of efficiency and accuracy against Michigan to the likes that the Wolverines have not faced this year?
I think that's probably a fair point. And looking up numbers before we did this, Ohio State has faced 3 defenses that were top 40. Looking at S&P, S&P has its strengths and weaknesses, but at least it ranks teams 1 through 130. 3 teams that were top 40 in defense, and Michigan's faced 3 teams that were top 40 in offense. So neither one of these teams has really experienced too many teams on the level the opponents are facing. Neither one of these teams has faced an opponent that is as good as Ohio State is offensively or Michigan is defensively. So one of the big questions going into this game really is how much does their ability translate? Looking at Michigan, knowing this is an Ohio State podcast, right? I mean, Michigan's faced Notre Dame is 27th in S&P offense. Western Michigan's the next is 37th, and then Wisconsin is 12th, which Wisconsin being at 12th offensively, I think brings up some questions. But I think the point there is in the Purdue game, something we mentioned, 49-20. One of my big takeaways is Ohio State should have scored a lot more than 20 points, given that they're the 5th ranked S&P offense in the country. the Maryland game, as much as that was a bad game, I think it was a real testament to the team that they were able to outscore Maryland in a shootout, because if they were able to do that around the time of the Purdue game, they probably win that game in a shootout. I think that says a lot about how Ohio State's evolved. The question is, how is that going to translate against Michigan, a very aggressive defense, a very disruptive defense, given that Ohio State has sometimes struggled a little bit with pressure? I don't think we know that answer, and I don't think we can give it. And the reason is neither one of these teams has faced anyone of the caliber that they're facing this week.
Yeah, and I think the other side of the ball, too, there's a lot – if we're looking at things that are positives or potential positives for Ohio State, we flagged early in the year after the Oregon State game, and it kind of frustrated a lot of Ohio State fans. We flagged earlier in the year that – they were giving up really long runs to a specific type of player. And linebackers and safeties were taking poor angles. There was poor gap assignment. And you had these speed burner track guys that were blowing the doors off of Ohio State, taking advantage of slight poor angles. And the same thing with TCU. We saw the same thing against Maryland, and Michigan is not the type of team. Look, I think Michigan's a great team, but I think if we're talking about matchups, and that's one of the things that we try to talk about but don't always do because we're so focused on the numbers. If you take a step away from the numbers and look at the matchups, Michigan's offense is not built to do what, say, a Matt Canada offense did against Ohio State last week. And that, if we're, again, looking for something that sort of adds some variability and some question marks to this game in favor of Ohio State, that'd be one for me.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because we've talked a lot on this podcast. We do our reviews every Monday and kind of go over what happens schematically. And every week it's been the same thing. It's been those boundary runs by small, speedy backs that have killed Ohio State. And Karan Higdon is a great back, but I'm not sure he fits that profile of, a TCU, Oregon State, or Maryland, the guys that have been involved in those games. And so it will be interesting. The one thing that Michigan does do, I think, a little bit similar to those other teams, and I heard you talk about this, Josh, but I think one thing Michigan does do is a lot of pre-snap movement. And so it'll be interesting to see if Ohio State changes their tendency for how they're scheming against that movement before the snap, because I think that's one of the things, like Maryland did, is getting those unbalanced lines and moving to the strong side of the field, and that's where Ohio State got caught. And it'll be curious to me if they take that same strategy against Michigan, because the Wolverines like to move guys around. So, Josh, I'm curious your take on that, and if you think that Ohio State needs to do something different schematically to counter that.
It's definitely something we hit on in the podcast, and I'll give you a statistic that I think is pretty interesting defensively for Ohio State. So Ohio State's 20th in the country in third and long conversion percentage allowed. They are dead last, 130 out of 130 in marginal explosiveness on passing down situations. And the fact that you can be both of those things is kind of startling, right? That
you need to unpack those nerd words a little bit, even for me.
Yeah. So, point being that S&P does metrics where they sort of isolate not just what percentage of third down conversions do you allow in a third and long situation, but when you do allow a conversion, what does that end up happening? Do they have a really long play? Do they just get the first down? And in Ohio State's case, actual third and long conversion percentage allowed 20% is 20th nationally. It's not a bad number, and Ohio State's pretty good. And I think this week on your podcast you mentioned that if you looked at most of Maryland's plays, they had a lot of stuffs. They had a lot of negative plays. It's just when you give up a play, it tends to be huge at a ridiculous rate. Again, dead last in passing down explosive plays allowed. So I think that's kind of part of the problem is the Ohio State's either in the right position to make a play and they do really well, or they're in the wrong position and they end up giving a 60-yard touchdown run. I have no doubt that Harbaugh is going to have a lot of motions, unbalanced lines. He's going to do a lot of stuff with his tight ends. It helps they have Tariq Black, because I think sometimes people miss the fact that it's not just that Black's a good player. What Black allows you to do is move around Peoples-Jones and move around Black so you can't isolate him on a corner as easily. Maybe you get him on a linebacker or something. And formationally just try to get them doing things like we saw in the Maryland game where the safeties are rotating over from a 2-safety set to a 1-safety set. And as that free safety rolls over to the middle of the field, you run a counter from in the direction where he's rotating from, and there's really nobody there to stop him. Definitely been a combination of missed assignments and a little bit guys like Borland honestly just haven't had the reaction speed or the ability, in my personal view, to sort of deal with it when bad things happen, so it all compounds. But I have no doubt Michigan's going to at least try to exploit it, even though like Daniel said, it's not like Maryland where they're more based off that kind of an offense.
Yeah, it's kind of.
And we talked about one of the examples we gave was our preview on the Penn State game. Going into that game, Ohio State had been gashed against TCU and Oregon State to an extent in wins, and we said that Miles Sanders wasn't that type of running back, and Penn State wasn't that type of team offensively, and we saw that be an opportunity for Ohio State to have some wins defensively, and Penn State fans just killed us. They're like, no way, Miles Sanders is super fast. And my point was, it's not that he's fast. Every D1 running back is fast. It's what the point Josh made last week. He's not a wide receiver playing running back. And there's a little bit of difference there, but it's enough to make a 7-yard gain be a 70-yard gain.
Well, and I think that's a great point, because watching this Ohio State defense, I feel like the biggest difference with this defense than in years past is some of those big plays that they might give up in the past would have been 10, 15, 20-yard runs, but they're missing tackles in the back end, and now those are becoming the 80-yard runs that we're seeing. So I think that's where Ohio State, Josh, you mentioned it, they're converting defensively on third downs pretty well, but when they're not converting, instead of picking up a 10, 15-yard first down, it goes for an 80-yard touchdown, and that's the big difference for me. So Daniel, I want to stay with you. I'm it's interesting looking around here, because the power ratings for this game are kind of all over the place. You've got, I think FPI before home field advantage taken into account, only like a 4 or 5 point difference between Michigan and Ohio State. You've got S&P Plus, closer to where the spread's at right now with 7. You guys, we'll get into the actual modeling, but you have it a little higher. Is this pretty common, you think, for these two teams? Because it feels like to me there is a bigger discrepancy with a lot of these models than some of the matchups we've seen in the past.
So I think there's 2 points here. One point I'm going to make, and the second one I'm going to roll it over to Josh, because he's got a good point about FPI. But one thing we said on the show, and I've been saying all year, is everybody feels like this Ohio State team has 2 or 3 losses. And I'm sure that's a point that's been discussed on the forums on your site. It feels like this is an 8-3 type Ohio State team, but look, both of these teams are 10-1, and so there's a lot of, and we're pretty in tune with Michigan fans as well. I think there's a lot of apprehension over there, because coming into this game every season, the pressure's been on Urban Meyer to win this game. Now the pressure is on Harbaugh. And so not only is there pressure there, but there's pressure on him like he's playing an 8-3 or 7-4 type of Ohio State team, and he's actually not. So I think that's where you get some of the perception, or where the game is more than we think it might be, because we're undervaluing Ohio State to this point relative to their record. But also some of these advanced statistics are pretty crazy, and Josh, you might want to get into that.
Right. So there's a couple complaints we've had this year. One, S&P Plus is something we reference a lot. We have a tremendous amount of respect for Bill Connolly and what they do. But they changed their formula up where it's a lot more reactive during the season. And one of the things we've been seeing is S&P seems to be giving a tremendous amount of credit to blowouts. So if you win games by really large margins, it almost overcorrects. And we're seeing a lot of teams from Group of 5 conferences ranked really, really high, App State or Utah State or what have you. And I think it's because it gives so much credit to blowouts. And the second thing I'll give specific to FPI to sort of point out where things a lot of times in these advanced metrics don't make sense is their current remaining strength of schedule calculation. So LSU remaining strength of schedule is 9th in the country. The only team they have left to play is Texas A&M. Ohio State is behind them at 11th in the country. They have to play number 4 Michigan and number 40 Northwestern. So obviously somehow in their metric, playing a team that's harder than anyone LSU plays, balanced with playing an extra game against a team that's at least pretty good in Northwestern, somehow it decides that's easier than playing only Texas A&M. And to give you another example, Alabama, they'll play FPI number 3 and FPI number 18, and their strength of schedule is 14th. Michigan plays FPI number 7 and FPI number 40, 2 teams that are worse than the 2 teams Alabama will play, and they're ranked ahead of Alabama in remaining strength of schedule at 13th. So and you can debate whether those teams are good or not, but the point is internal to FPI and its own rankings, I can't square away how FBI's remaining strength of schedule is calculated. It doesn't make sense internal to how it ranks its own teams. So you have to be extremely careful when applying these advanced statistics to make sure you have some grasp of how they work and how they operate. There's a lot like FBI that I frankly will refuse to use because a lot of times FBI, like this remaining strength of schedule statistic, just isn't in any way, in my view, internally consistent. So I don't think it's usable.
Sheer probability would tell you if you've got a game where you're only 40% favored to win, and then you have to play an extra game after that, you have a lot less chance of winning out than just playing one team like Texas A&M. So
and regardless of who that other team is, just like you said, probability, and we do this all the time where you look at your opponents and they don't look that tough, and each one of them has like a 20%, 30%, chance that you might lose. But in aggregate, across the whole of those, when you add it all together, the chances are pretty high. And just like you said, even if you don't consider the fact that it's Northwestern, if it's anybody, you would think that the remaining schedule would be harder than a single game in Texas A&M.
Right. And the last point I'll make on this is you have to understand, I think, what they're calculating. I believe what they're calculating is probably your odds to go 500 or to win a game out of that set. And the reason I say that, South Carolina's strength of schedule is 63rd in FPI, remaining strength of schedule. They play Clemson and Akron. Clemson's the number one team in FPI. Akron's strength of schedule is 35th. They play Ohio University and South Carolina. So FBI thinks it's much easier to play Clemson and Akron than to play Ohio and South Carolina. I think it's because it's easier to get a win against Akron than it is to get a win against one of Ohio and South Carolina. But obviously, if you're a playoff contender, you'd much rather play Ohio and South Carolina than play Clemson and Akron.
Yeah.
Final. Sorry, I keep jumping in.
No,
here.
Go ahead.
The last point that I want to make sort of piggybacks on that, because we talk about strength of schedule a lot on the show, and it's some flack we've caught from Notre Dame fans this year because we'll talk about how Notre Dame's schedule hasn't been that hard since the Michigan game, and a lot of times they're the all name schedule, right? But a lot of times it happens that Notre Dame has a lot of 6 and 6, 7 and 5s in there, and they'll turn around and say, look, Alabama's playing, the Citadel, or Ohio State's playing UNLV. But the issue for playoff contenders is how many teams on your schedule are good enough to actually beat an elite team. So you could have 2 top 10 teams and a bunch of trash and have a harder schedule than someone that plays a bunch of 6 and 6 teams that an elite team would never lose to. The problem is most strength of schedule metrics are based on how hard it is to get to a bowl, not how hard it is to get to the playoffs.
So, Josh, I want to get now to the model. If you would, first let's start. I want to get your individual opinions on the game, and I know you've shared them on your own podcast. But I want to first focus on what the model says. So what does the model have for this game? And kind of, give us the highlights, not only the projected score, but as well, you mentioned yards per play and some of the numbers expected from this contest.
Right. So I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. And we have a video on our own YouTube channel that explains the model in depth, but that takes about 30 minutes. So just shorthand, based off our previous discussion, how it works. One of the statistics we calculate is percentage of opponent offenses averages you allow. So if your opponent's average 5 yards per carry, you allow 4, you allow 80% of their averages. Ohio State's allowing 103% of opponent rushing averages and 107% of opponent passing averages. That's not a good mark. Most numbers are inflated because you do play some teams like UNLV. Everybody plays those. That inflates everybody's offensive statistics a little bit. So you'd like to see that number be 95% or lower just to be average or above average. Most teams going into Ohio State as a neutral statistic have had a better offensive day than their average day against everybody else they've played. On the flip side, Michigan allowing 72% of opponent rushing averages, 72% of opponent passing averages. Those are really good marks. Anything under 75% is a lead against the run. Anything under 75% against the pass is crazy good. It's just very difficult to hold teams to below their average passing game. That's why passing games are important, because they're a lot more consistent despite the quality of an opposing defense. When we run all that through and look at your own past histories, our model is predicting Ohio State will rush for about 3.2 yards per carry and throw for 6.2 yards per attempt. Neither one of those numbers is really good enough to consistently move an offense, and that's projecting about 4.8 yards per play based off tendencies. Michigan's predicted to get 5.2 yards per carry and 9.1 yards per rush, or per pass attempt, those are obviously very high marks. And based off their tendencies, that's about 6.8 yards per play. So that's a 4.8 to 6.8 per play advantage for Michigan in our projection. And then based off your own past history, it models that score out to be 39, Michigan 39, Ohio State 24.
It's interesting to me because with those numbers, basically, so with the 39-24 projected margin, really, it seems like Ohio State. There's two routes here. Either the defense shows up, which it hasn't really done very much this year for the Buckeyes, or the offense is just going to have to perform at a level similar to what it's done, maybe against Maryland, where they run for 5-6 yards a carry, and then are really efficient with the pass game because it doesn't. I think if you're going with the odds, what's more likely, Ohio State shutting Michigan down, which it has not done very consistently with anybody, or the offense showing up? I think they're just going to have to hope that the offense is absolutely as good as it was last week, or else they may not have much of a chance in this game.
Right, and I agree with that. But the one thing I'll say as a caveat to this, and this is sometimes where we get a little skeptical of the numbers, Michigan hasn't been able to get 6.8 yards per play very often. So even when they kind of exploded in a couple games, Western Michigan early in the year, SMU. And we've kind of flagged that as a potential issue with Higdon. If you look at his per carry numbers through about 9 weeks through the season, all his averages were built off 3 games where he had 8+ yard per carry days. And the rest of the games he was struggling. I don't think he hit 4 yards per carry until a few weeks ago. When they played Rutgers, they had 6.76 yards per play. When they played Indiana, they had 6.5. I question whether Michigan can actually scale up that well because they're a little clunky. Pro-style offenses they are consistent against bad teams. And this is, I'm sure, a kind of a reverse of a complaint Ohio State fans have with J.T. Barrett. So they can do well against, really good defenses. When you're having a bad day, the pro-style offense generally scores points. But they also don't scale up. So when you play really bad defenses, a spread offense like J.T. Barrett and Ohio State will put 60 on them in a way Michigan can't. So it's a little odd to say that Ohio State's defense just statistically isn't that great. But I guess the caveat I would throw is that pro-style offense, which in past few years has been a boon for Michigan playing against an elite Ohio State offense where they do better than you would expect. I think it kind of hurts them this week. They're not going to be able to exploit an Ohio State defense that maybe has some deficiencies because, like we said, they're just not built to sort of exploit a team like that.
So, Daniel, I want to get into now, your individual opinions, kind of how you see this game playing out. What kind of scoring game do you see in this one, and who do you think ends up winning and why?
So I'm still going with Michigan. It is interesting because we did a hypothetical on this game a few weeks ago, and there was a much wider gap. It was 37-17 for Michigan, and most of that gap that's been closed has been offensively for Ohio State. And those question marks for me really, to me, underscore what we don't know about this game. And it's crazy because we're in week 13 and there's still things we don't know about these two teams because they're so different. They're so incredibly different, and they've kind of faced different teams and played differently against them. I like Michigan in this game. Defense travels. That is an old adage that does work very well. I'm a little concerned about Ohio State's inability to score offensive points against Michigan State, which is the only other defense that's similar. But the difference is Michigan State's offense, especially without Lewerke, is atrocious. So they had a lot of opportunities, a lot of short fields, and didn't really put up a number. Haskins was 5.8 yards per attempt in that game. It was really cold, bad weather. I still have some uneasy feelings about it. But on the flip side, I don't think Michigan's going to be able to do what a Maryland did. And I think it's going to give Michigan fans, I said this on MGO blog last week or earlier this week, they're going to be a lot more uncomfortable in this game going into the third and fourth quarter than they want to be or than they expect to be because their offense isn't going to be able to exploit. So I actually forget what I picked on the show, but I've got, I think maybe 7-point spread in favor of Michigan, and I would not be surprised if we see some things from both of these teams that show that we just didn't know as much as we thought we did.
Yeah, Josh, what's your own gut feel about Saturday?
Right, so not all that different from what Daniel stated. I'll sort of back it up with opinion a little bit. Michigan State's fourth in S&P defense. Ohio State scored 17 offensive points. Penn State's 12th. They scored 27. TCU's 27th. They scored 26. So I think it's pretty reasonable based off that, if you want to make a projection, you should project Ohio State to score in the low 20s. It's consistent with everything else and with Michigan being a better defense than those teams. So I have Michigan about 21, Ohio State 21, and then Michigan sort of projecting it out. I don't think they score as much as this model does project. I just don't think it scales quite that well. But I still have them at 31, so 31-21. Again, a little bit more than the current spread, but not the gap that the model is seeing.
And I think the key for this game, in my opinion, for Ohio State is this game, and Josh, maybe correct me if you think differently, if the winning score is under 30 points, it's a 50-50 game. If they can keep Michigan from getting to 30, it's a 50-50 game, in my opinion.
And I agree with that.
I tell you what's interesting for me, guys, is I think it's going to, because both of these teams, we've seen at various points in the year, offensively have problems scoring in the red zone. And I know that was Ohio State's biggest problem against Purdue is, they drove the ball down the field between the 20s, but then they got down inside the red zone and just couldn't punch it in. And that's why they wound up only scoring 20 against Purdue. So Michigan had a huge problem against Indiana this past week punching it in. So I think for me, one of the things that could be really interesting is not just the yards per play numbers between the 20s, but which team can punch it in this week, because Michigan did not do it against Indiana. Ohio State finally started doing it against Maryland, and it'll be interesting if the incorporation of the zone read with Haskins being able to keep it at times, that to me will be an interesting factor to see whether Ohio State can score if it gets down inside the 20 against Michigan.
And personnel-wise, that's also an interesting – I know people are kind of dismissing it, but the Tate Martell factor, because he actually did move the ball pretty well on the ground against a great Michigan State defense when he came in for those few plays. I don't think they would go to that in this game because generally big games, rivalry games, unless something crazy happens like Jalen Hurts to Tua – you don't see it. So if the offense is scoring, I don't see them going there, but I could see some red zone packages, something to mix it up, because he was really effective and looked super comfortable in the offense when he came in against Michigan State.
Yeah, no, Josh, it's interesting because it seemed from our point of view here, covering Ohio State, we kind of felt like after the Michigan State game we were going to see a lot of Tate Martell against Maryland, but what ended up happening is, for the most part, some of those situations where they might have been inclined to run the zone read, they just kept Haskins in there and they started running it with him. So I think that was almost Ohio State's way of saying, oh, okay, look, we've got to incorporate this into our offense, but instead of bringing in Tate Martell to do it, let's just force Dwayne Haskins to be comfortable with it. And, look, he didn't look graceful out there running the zone read, but I thought it was a huge improvement to their offense by adding that dimension.
I think it was, and something we've talked about a lot on our show is actually in regard to Auburn and how they've struggled offensively at times, and their struggles track pretty heavily with a red zone conversion percentage. So Auburn is at their lowest red zone conversion percentage since they were at 2012 when they had an awful season. They fired Gene Chizik. And that happened early in the season when we were already throwing that up as the big red flag to show that Auburn's offense was going to take a nosedive. The reason for that is when you run a run spread zone read based offense with a short passing game, it's all inside out. You've got to be able to run up the middle. You've got to be able to operate the zone read in order to keep the linebackers inside and keep the safeties up so that you can get to the edge. And it's especially true in the red zone because those safeties aren't all that far away from the line of scrimmage. If you try to run side to side, if the safeties aren't having to watch the middle of the field and the linebackers aren't caught in the middle, worried about that inside run, they're so much closer to the line of scrimmage that it's easy for them to crash down on outside plays, and the whole offense kind of starts to shut down. So to your point, Haskins running the zone read more effectively is huge because the moment Ohio State gets an inside run game that's effective, everything else in that offense is going to work well. And the red zone amplifies all those problems. So it's definitely a big deal. And, running the zone read's hard. It takes them a long time. We've often talked about the fact that Jalen Hurts was actually remarkably bad at running the zone read and pulling the ball. And that's one of the reasons they struggled so badly in big games against good defenses. So I absolutely think this is a major factor. And they're trying to keep the passing game with Haskins, but also shore up that inside run game so other stuff works a little better. Daniel,
any final thoughts you'd like to add here before we wrap things up?
Really just, I think what we've been saying all along, the model closing was an eye-opener for us. Closing a 7-point gap in the model in just a couple of weeks' time says to me that, one, there might be some defensive bugaboos hidden for Michigan that we're not seeing, and two, that Ohio State offensively is good enough that they're going to be in a game with anybody. Because if you think about a model projecting 21 to 24 points against a top 3 defense, that's pretty significant. So to me, that says I think Ohio State fans are a little down on their team right now because, like I said before, it doesn't feel like that dominant elite Ohio State team. But they also got to remember they're 11-1 in what right now is being considered a bad year and still has an outside shot at the playoffs. So this game for me is actually really interesting, not just because it's a rivalry, because it has a huge impact on the college football landscape this season.
Well, guys, I tell you what, this has been a lot of fun. If you want to read more, watch more of Daniel and Josh's work, go to secfans.com. You can also catch them on Twitter at secfans. Their preview videos of some of the top games every week are just absolutely marvelous. If you're a nerd like me, you will especially appreciate them. But even if you're not a statistics nerd, I promise they are worth the time invested. So, guys, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's been a great show. I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving. And I tell you what, once we get into the playoff matchup set, I probably would like to have you back on, and we can kind of look at some of the matchups with the playoffs, because this has been great for me, and I'm sure people will enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, guys. Thanks again. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Once again, you can catch their work at secfans.com.
Stretch runtime here at Unscripted Ohio. Kick up your feet as we cross the finish line with the Buckeye Beat, the latest in Ohio State news and notes.
Kick the tires and light the fires, Big Daddy.
All right, Austin Fox of the Wolverine is here with me. Austin, how's your week going, buddy? I hope you got some big plans here for Thanksgiving.
It's going good so far. There's an extra buzz around Ann Arbor, and I'm sure there is too in Columbus. So it's been a lot of fun so far. Yeah,
it's a little bit of a different feel, I think, for both Ann Arbor and Columbus this year, because this year there's a lot of nervous frustration in Columbus and a lot of nervous anxiety in Ann Arbor. So let's talk about that. What is the sentiment? What is the feeling, the emotion in Ann Arbor right now around this Michigan team that is a favorite for the first time in well, actually, just the second time, I think, in 14 years or 15 years or something like that. So what is the feeling there about this game?
For the most part, Michigan fans, they're pretty confident. They think Michigan has the better team, and they like their chances on Saturday. Obviously, the game is in Columbus, though, so there's cause for concern in that area. But Michigan feels like they're playing well for the past 2 months or so. And, there's an excitement. Like you said, Michigan hasn't been favored in this matchup in a long time. 2004 was actually the last time they were favored in Columbus. So Michigan fans like their chances, and there's a buzz around Ann Arbor, and people just can't wait for Saturday.
So I got to ask you, first I want to start off with the Chase Winovich injury. Has there been any update on exactly, we know it's his shoulder, but has there been any explanation? I know Michigan keeps that pretty tight, but have they said exactly what the injury is and what his status is right now?
No, they haven't. The only information that has come out is that Jim Harbaugh, after Saturday's game, said that the x-rays came back negative, so that was better news than expected. There was a rumor going around that he had a broken collarbone, but that's not the case. And honestly, I would say his status is 50-50 for Saturday. That's really the only information we have at this point on him.
So what's the what's the expectation here for this game? Do you have a feel for what people expect, the type of game? You mentioned people are pretty confident. Do you feel like this is going to be a high-scoring game because of Ohio State's offense and then also their defensive struggles? Do you think it's going to wind up being a low-scoring game? How are people viewing this as to what kind of game we should expect on Saturday up there?
I think for the most part, it'll be on the lower end, maybe 24-21, 24-17 kind of game. Michigan's defense is playing incredibly well, as most people know. And I think this will be the best offense Michigan has seen all year. But it's hard to, imagine Ohio State lighting up their defense. But on the flip side, Michigan's offense is good, but it's not great or elite by any means. So I don't see Michigan lighting up Ohio State's defense either, even though it has struggled. So I think a game somewhere in the 20s, upper teens is the most likely outcome in terms of score.
Austin, watching Michigan again against Indiana, the one thing that stood out to me with the offense is that, they've been moving the ball pretty well throughout the year, but when they've been getting in the red zone, they haven't been real consistent punching it in, and that was a really big deal against Indiana. What can Michigan do in your mind to improve that? Because they're going to have to score touchdowns, I think, against Ohio State. And same for Ohio State. They're going to have to score touchdowns when they get down in there in the red zone against Michigan. So what do you think Michigan can do to be more successful when they get down inside that 20?
Yeah, that's a great point you bring up. Michigan's offense really has struggled when it's gotten in the red zone this year. They had to settle for 6 field goals this past Saturday, all of which came in the red zone. So I think they need to open up the playbook a little more. It's gotten a little stale at times when they've gotten in the red zone. There's been some criticism surrounding Pep Hamilton, who most people think calls the plays. I think we will see Michigan open up the playbook more. They tend to get a little conservative on second and third down in the red zone. So I think we'll see more passes, maybe a little trickeration. They like to run jet sweeps with Donovan Peoples-Jones and Ronnie Bell. They're 2 young receivers. So I think we're going to see more plays like that in the red zone so they don't have to, constantly settle for field goals like they have been. It's
kind of funny you mentioned the trick plays. That was actually going to be my next question because Michigan did kind of open up the last 2 years. They have run a lot more trick plays, especially in 2016. I think they opened it up and surprised Ohio State with some of the counters and the trick plays. Do you expect them to be a little bit more wide open in general against Ohio State than maybe they have been here throughout the season?
Yeah, I do. I think we're going to see a lot more, creative plays like that. We've seen glimpses of it so far this year. They've been playing sophomore cornerback Ambry Thomas on offense a little bit, and he's considered the fastest guy on the team. So I think we'll see more of that on Saturday. Like I was saying, Donovan Peoples-Jones, they like to get him the ball on jet sweep, and they actually had him throw a pass last Saturday. So they've been showing small glimpses of trickeration and creative plays like that, and I think they're going to pull out all the stops on Saturday in terms of opening up the playbook.
Defensively, Michigan nobody has been successful against them, and it will be interesting because you mentioned Ohio State's passing attack is, I think, by a large margin, tougher than anybody Michigan has faced this year. But it will be interesting to see how Ohio State does. Do they go tempo? How much do they throw it? Can they run the ball first? But how much do they throw it, and how successful they are? From what you've seen of Michigan's secondary, how do you think they will hold up if they're in a situation where Ohio State's in kind of an air raid offense and throwing on them every down?
I think they're going to handle it well, but Ohio State's passing attack will be by far the best Michigan has seen this year. They have arguably the best corner trio in the country with Brandon Watson, Lavert Hill, and David Long. So these guys will be tested. And we actually saw them. They didn't really struggle last week with Indiana's up-tempo, fast-paced offense, but it was probably the poorest performance Michigan's defense had put on all year. They gave up 385 yards, which were a season high. So if Ohio State comes out and flings it all over the yard like I think they do for the most part, I think they'll rack up quite a few passing yards, but I think for the most part Michigan's DBs will, hold their own and at least keep Ohio State's passing attack in check. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Ohio State have some success, at least through the air, like they have basically all year.
I'm curious, should the worst-case scenario happen on the Michigan end and Ohio State, win this game on Saturday, and they're certainly not favored, and I'm not sure Buckeye fans are very confident of that happening, but if that were to happen, I mean, how crushed would the Michigan fan base be after such a remarkable season? I mean, the way Michigan started out this season, it looked kind of hairy, but they have really turned it around and just been dominant ever since. So, that would be, I would think, a crushing blow if that were to happen.
No doubt, it would be devastating, and that's an understatement. That would mean no Big Ten East title, obviously, for Michigan, no Big Ten championship, no college football playoff. So it would be devastating, as I'm sure it would be also for Ohio State if they wind up losing. Michigan, ever since the Notre Dame game, obviously has been on fire. They've won 10 in a row. They've been a different team ever since that Notre Dame game. And, I mean, they've had their eyes set on the college football playoff now for about a month and a half or so. So if they were to lose on Saturday, it would be crushing for everybody involved, the coaches, the players, the fans, because, like I was saying, their goal is to make the college football playoff. So a loss on Saturday would just, I don't want to say ruin the season, but in a lot of ways it would.
I think the other scenario, Austin, that's interesting to me is if Michigan beats Ohio State, but then Georgia beats Alabama, and suddenly Michigan could find itself outside the playoff, despite the fact it's played like a top 4 team all year long, not lost since the first week of the season, but could potentially still find itself outside the playoff, despite winning the Big Ten, beating its rival, having only one loss. That seems to me, just from a a neutral objector, like I would find that would be the impetus for me to say, maybe 4 teams is not the right number of teams in the playoff. What do you think about that scenario?
Right. That's kind of the $1 million question at this point. It's been discussed a lot here around Ann Arbor over the last few weeks, ever since the first set of college football playoff rankings came out. And obviously Michigan fans aren't too fond of Alabama, but they're rooting for the Crimson Tide to win out at this point. They were glad they beat LSU a few weeks ago, and they want them to beat Auburn, and they want them to beat Georgia in the SEC championship, because a potential Georgia win, like you were saying, would just create havoc. Would that be enough for the Bulldogs to leapfrog Michigan? A lot of people are concerned about that. On the flip side, others have said, how can you leave out a Big Ten champion, one-loss team if it was Michigan? And I totally understand that argument too, but Georgia also would have a great argument to get in. So it's going to create a lot of chaos if it happens, and Michigan fans are just praying that the Crimson Tide run the table from here on out.
It's kind of funny. This is the one subject right now Ohio State and Michigan fans are unified on. They're both rooting for Alabama as of this moment. Now, after Saturday,
Exactly.
I have a feeling one half of that segment of the population will be rooting against Alabama after Saturday, but
Yep, it's going to completely flip.
It will completely flip, yeah. Right now, Michigan and Ohio State fans are all thinking the same thing, but that'll change after Saturday, depending on who wins and who loses.
Sure.
So, all right, well, you can catch Austin on Twitter at AustinFox42, and, of course, you can read his work leading up to the game here and beyond on thewolverine.com. Austin, thanks for taking some time out of your Thanksgiving week here to preview this game for us.
Thanks a lot for having me on, guys. I appreciate it.
And that will wrap it up here for the Unscripted Ohio podcast. I truly hope that you appreciated the insights, the analysis of Daniel and Josh. Again, check out their work, secfans.com, or on Twitter at secfans. Also, thanks to Austin Fox for previewing this game from the Michigan perspective. It will be interesting to see this play out here on Saturday. But that is going to do it for me. Of course, you can check me out on Twitter if you've not already done so at KYLAM8. I didn't even get to the college football playoff selection stuff. As irritated as I was about that Tuesday evening on Twitter, maybe I'll talk to Bill a little bit more about that tomorrow. But in the meantime, of course, you can catch us on BuckeyeGrove.com every Monday and Friday. And, of course, you can catch part 2 of this edition of the podcast, the preview of the Ohio State-Michigan game. You can catch that on Thanksgiving. I hope everybody enjoys their Thanksgiving. Of course, come back, follow us on your medium of choice, whether that be iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. And, of course, be sure to rate and review us, especially if you enjoy the show. Hopefully, the algorithms will boost us enough so that other Buckeye fans continue to catch on. We're very excited about the podcast and hope to do many, many more editions for you in the future. So have a great Thanksgiving, everybody. I will be back tomorrow with part 2. Bill Bender and Mark Gibler coming up. Very excited about that. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Go Bucks.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.